So having that alignment to the strategy is core, making sure that when you're evaluating, performance objectives, when you're going through your performance reviews, that the goals of your team members are aligned to your goals, which are aligned to the corporate goals. So having that connective tissue across the board.
Welcome to the Data Heads podcast, where we're going to be discussing scaling data and AI center of excellence with Charles Boyle. We're excited to have him on as he has over 20 years experience and is a seasoned executive, having his most recent titles being a chief data and analytics officer at Octo Telematics, as well as recently being the chief data scientist at Honeywell's Connected Enterprises. We're excited because throughout his career, he has specialized in building and scaling high-performing data and AI tools, focusing on democratization and monetization of AI and ML implementation. His expertise spans multiple industries, and so we're very excited to have him on here to discuss bringing in scaling data and AI centers of excellence. So thank you, Charles, for being on here.
Thank you for having me, Ian.
Yeah, so I know we kind of had a number of different conversations spanning over a number of different places, and we've kind of gone all over the place, but and calls leading up to this. But would you mind just kind of breaking down, before we kind of get into the depths of this conversation, what are the primary components of building data and AI center of excellence?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ian. Like when I think about all the opportunities that I've had throughout my career to really build and scale data and AI COEs, it really comes down to a few primary components. And I break them down between people, process, data, and technology. Your resources, your human resources are some of the most important and impactful components, to your business and to the success of your organization. I mean, the data is kind of the foundational component of being able to build your analytic and AI solutions. And, some of the tech tools bring some of that efficiency that you're looking to gain throughout the professional process.
So if you wouldn't mind maybe breaking down some of the specific impacts that each one has. So like, if you don't have the right people, how have you seen that either like sandbag building the establishment of a center of excellence, or really taking it on to the next level? And are you talking about you must have a team of like 9s and 10s, like perfect ideal members, or walk me through, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's more of kind of roadmap development, right? When you think about, the phasing approach of building an organization that's focused around data and AI, the data being the core components, the bugaboos are that you don't have the right data engineering resources to kind of drive the data acquisition and procurement and the munging and wrangling that takes place, the pipelines into your data lake houses and whatnot. You don't have the data architects, which are really managing the data model and the maintenance of that data model. So all the transformations that take place, taking raw into transformed and driving insights. And then, kind of the core components of analytic development when you think about having BI developers or BI engineers, as well as, your seasoned data scientists who are actually actively building those predictive and prescriptive models and integrating, kind of that AI intelligence into your different products and services. One of the other areas that I think, you tend to think is kind of a gap is the demand generation process, right? Who's managing the business of, the intake and the evaluation of the different ideas? Because you can't go in there thinking you could boil the ocean, right?
Or get buried in the ad hoc requests that come down from the
Right. I mean,
executive
actually,
leadership.
it comes down to prioritization, right? I'm like, if
Exactly.
I've got 100 and I only have the staff to support, 10 different initiatives, what are the top 10 initiatives that are going to drive the most impact to my business? So, I've had the opportunity to bring in chiefs of staff focused on, kind of that analytic intake process, the evaluation of, kind of a right to win, whether we have the right data, is, the specific data science techniques or the models that are being requested, the actually right approach to solving the business problem.
So for people at scale, right? So if we're talking about a small organization that's maybe 1,000 people versus a company that's in the tens of thousands, and they don't necessarily have the opportunity for chiefs of staff. How do you garner some of the executive leadership's trust to kind of do that prioritization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've implemented the idea of having like these cross-functional core teams that help with that intake process and kind of the evaluation of whether it's the appropriate problem for us to be solving with data science and or AI, doing the analysis around customer validation and building the business case to support that development, and then being able to support presenting to get buy-in with the L1 leadership, right? At the end of the day, having those kind of data science councils that bring together your C-suite leaders and make sure that they're bought into the investment that we're making in the technology, in the data, to
Right.
develop these solutions that are actually going to drive a specific return on investment. And hopefully it's hitting those multiples that they're expecting.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So then, if what would you say is like tooling or identifying the proper technology, kind of in that center of excellence?
Yeah, from a tools perspective, I'm always looking at going cloud native, right? There's this migration pattern of coming out of the on prem environments and moving to the cloud to be more nimble. Having an appropriate data lake house to integrate the data sets and be able to do the transformations and all the calculations to enable more efficient use of analytics, whether it's at scale or not. But at the end of the day, also having state of the art business intelligence tools. I've evaluated a number of different BI tools throughout my career, and I have my own favorites, and it is what it is. Everyone is classically trained in different tool sets, but also having a true analytics platform that you feel comfortable with, that the data scientists on the team and the AI and machine learning engineers are comfortable leveraging and collaborating as a team, because ultimately implementing the domain expertise is a critically important facet of developing these more advanced analytics tools.
So when you come into an org, do you process and evaluate like, hey, we're going to persist what is there because that's where the skill set base is, or do you try to like, because if it's people and technology, and you kind of have to do this pairing of like, okay, do we bring in a whole new tool set, which means we have all the people have all the wrong skills, and so then we have to upskill everybody or cross train everybody into a new tool stack, which like how many of us have had every company that they've been at has been a entirely new tool stack, which is not
Almost
that big of a
always.
deal. Yeah, right. So, like, how much of that balance, like, how do you actually create, like, you're building a center of excellence. So then, how do you create that proper pendulum swinging of changing out the tool stack, which in some instances can take a couple years to kind of get fully um, implemented and actually providing that value versus just saying, hey, look, like we have the right people and they know the tools. They may not be the ideal tool set for where we want to go, but long term or even medium term, you kind of go with it because they're still pioneering and plotting the course. Like, how do you do that? What is
Sure.
your kind of
It
recommendation?
it is a balancing act, quite honestly, and at least the last 2 or 3 tenures that I've had in industry, I've gone into situations where I've taken the first 90 to 120 days to kind of evaluate and assess the current environment, right, and do that evaluation and business immersion around people, process, data, and technology. And when I look at the technology, it's really a kind of a combination of where the tech stack is today, where kind of the doing your typical SWOT analysis, right? Where are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats throughout the
Right.
organization, looking at the skills, whether they need to be upskilled from a talent perspective, but also budget plays an interesting dynamic in that, right? Like I
Yeah.
haven't always gone into
So,
situations where, I've got a bucket of money that I can go spend to swap
of
these out.
course.
But there's also opportunities where I've come in and evaluated different tools that I'm paying, a king's ransom for, and I don't really need that level of
Right.
capability. And could I scale back, do a little bit cost savings on the OpEx
Yep.
side, and then maybe parlay that arbitrage into another
Yeah.
opportunity.
Makes perfect sense. So how does that work when you're factoring in the people and that technology across industries? So like for example, like you were in the oil and gas and then um, utilities to like aerospace can have dramatically different, how do I articulate this, cultures centered around technology and how the organization is going to feel or accept on adopting new technology. So like pardon my negligence on this or ignorance on this, but my understanding is oil and gas is one of those industries that's a lot more rigid and a lot more slow to move.
That's correct.
And so, like, I'm assuming that factors and comes into play as well. Is that
It does. And what was interesting about my tenure at Honeywell is when we created the Center of Excellence, it was a hub and spoke model, where we were providing recommendations around best practices, around those tools, the techniques, the technology, but the actual execution, a majority of the time, was decentralized in the respective business units and operating companies, like aerospace, like oil and gas, like the building technologies groups. So they didn't always necessarily take our recommendations, but when there were synergies and economies of scale, because maybe we were picking up, at the enterprise level, some of the cost and the cost burden associated with that, um, they would be incented to take our
right?
recommendations. But it was a collaborative effort, right? Like at the end of the day, there were situations where I had ex aerospace engineers that were PhD data scientists in my COE that the heads of aerospace at Honeywell wanted on their teams respectively, and
Right.
I hired them. Well, because there was going to be projects that came to me from aerospace that I needed that inherent domain expertise, and vice versa when it came to technology that I was leveraging, in the center of excellence, and they weren't happy with their, I don't know, Alteryx instance. Okay, well, we're using Power BI, or we're using Click, or we're using Tableau.
Right.
Maybe there's an opportunity to share, and the cross training aspect of it all.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's always going to have to be no one, well, no shoe fits all feet, right?
Nope,
So
not at
like,
all, not at all.
so it's just going to have to be per the industry, per the company, and a huge center of collaboration and working together. So to that point, like where does like resource planning come in to play? So like the idea of like insourcing, outsourcing, bill versus buy, like these are very large like questions on how to like do that within the confines of that respective organization.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because throughout my career, I've had the distinct opportunity to manage both the in-house, kind of onshore resources, but also, kind of replicate my COE externally, offshore, and partner with a handful of really best in class vendor partners on the analytic services side. Um, Typically what you want to focus on is really executing what's table stakes, right? Like your commoditized roles like data engineering and the the management of say, kind of BI development, right?
Right.
Your table stakes BI developers. um, those are roles that you would feel comfortable outsourcing. The ones where you don't feel comfortable outsourcing and that you want to insource and keep in house are your data architects and your data scientists and machine learning folks, because there's IP associated with that you
Right.
obviously want to protect. Inherently, that's kind of the model that I've found successful and deployed at multiple organizations. It's just interesting. I've had a varied career over the last 20 plus years, where I've had the opportunity to work with folks across the globe, whether they be, data engineers in Poland, or, data scientists who, came out of India, or, in South America, Romania, all over the world. And it's been a luxury that I've had. I haven't had too many situations where I've had to swap out resources for poor performance.
Yeah. So that I love that idea that on the pieces that's going to have a large portion of either the intellectual property or the tribal knowledge of the business operations, because especially on the data architects, if you've done your proper data modeling, then you actually understand the process engineering behind the organization to make that happen properly. And so those type of core rules you're saying absolutely need to be in-house. And then as it comes to laying pipe work, to use like kind of a plumber's analogy,
Sure.
or dig in the trenches, um, those things can be outsourced or done externally to the company. And that's one of the ways that you found has been kind of a good like divide. But as it relates to versus like build versus buy, right? So is that kind of same in that same concept of like building models versus purchasing? Like, help me walk me through what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's the age old adage of evaluating, kind of the open source technology, and partnering with niche vendors. When you look at build versus buy versus partner, if it's core functionality that, there are best in class solutions already out there in the market, I'd rather go out and partner with those folks, or go out and buy it. Right? I don't want to have to reinvent the wheel, in the old saying there. But when it comes to managing, kind of new intellectual property that I'm going to develop, that it's going to give me a competitive advantage in the market, I want to make sure that I keep that close to home. So I want to incent the internal build process there. It's a balancing act, like with your budget, and kind of aligning on technology. One other dimension that we haven't mentioned is kind of the software engineers, right? Like when
Right.
I'm deploying these models into production, do I necessarily need those software engineers in house to execute, especially if it's a third party managed service that's deploying in it, the solution in an app, or something
Right.
to that effect. So those are other considerations that kind of always come into play.
So, do you have any like anecdotal stories on places, not getting into any specific company, but where you went one direction and then you were like, "Hey, lesson learned. Here's some of the big key takeaways." Where you decided, "Hey, we're going to build this," and then you're like, "We should have bought it." Or instances where it's the inverse and you're like, let's just build it, like let's just do this, and then we'll have some sort of like service agree or managed service provider do XYZ. Like, do you have any of those stories where you saw it go the wrong direction, even if it wasn't necessarily something from a decision you made?
Yeah, I think one of the best examples I have is we were swapping out during one of my tenures. We were swapping out a business intelligence tool,
Okay.
one where we were overpaying for functionality that it was overkill. And it was legacy, and it was something that was already kind of, built into the historical tool set, for the company, but it was only hitting upon a very small number of our core customers, right? Like
Right.
less than 50. But we were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to enable business intelligence reporting for these 20 or 30 customers. And we rushed to judgment. We did a very quick kind of evaluation of the tool sets that are out there, and we kind of jumped the gun, and we went down the Power BI route because we were an Azure shop, and we thought it would be
Right.
cheap, and it would keep us within our budget constraints. And when we thought about it after the fact, and we did the business model validation, it actually was very similar. And the payback, it took 2.5 years to get paid back on the change. because it wasn't as easy a lift and shift as
Right.
we were led to believe. And we actually worked with Microsoft and a Microsoft kind of recommended vendor to do that migration. But even with a pretty ironclad contract, they delivered maybe like 80% of the solution, and then when it came back to us and we had to do our part on the remaining migration work, we just didn't have the capacity to
Yeah,
do
and
so. So
eight,
it wound
the
up
last
costing more.
20% the last 20% of the work is 80%, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, especially like when it comes to validation, it's like you can build something in like, let's say, a couple months and spend another 6 months just making sure that it's right.
It's funny because I have a converse story to kind of go on the bookend to that last example. So, at Honeywell, we had the opportunity to bring in a new analytics platform. We actually went out, we partnered with an analytics service provider to be that kind of independent auditor. And we evaluated three or four different analytic platforms, and we got their recommendation, and we actually performed case studies, so actually executed on specific projects, testing the collaboration tool, testing the modeling capabilities of the tool. And we use data robot, data miner, like rapid miner,
Right.
data
Yeah.
iq, and we did it all right. And it's interesting that even when we rank ordered those specific tools, we were overridden by our chief technology officer at the time because of the
Yeah.
ability for those tools to integrate into the tech stack. It wasn't a consideration that we would have made on a normal basis, right? Like
Right.
you would, and again, a different time than we are today. But tech stack integration wasn't, wasn't a feature or kind of an assessment of ours in the rubric, even for the independent organization that was helping us run those tests. So
Right.
it's interesting that it could go both ways, right? Like you could do everything right, or you could do something wrong, and it makes all the world a difference.
Yeah, that's too funny. Like how some people can stumble upon success, right? And like just make the call and it worked out great. And then you do all the due diligence and then you're just kind of like side railed on budget or whatever, right? I mean, sometimes you have your 1 year, 3 year, 5 year plan. All of a sudden, the organization's facing revenue or cost constraints, and you now get budgeted and in such a capacity that your plans have to plan and shift. And so, how is it that you've been able to not only measure but communicate the value proposition of having a data and AI center of excellence?
Yeah, I think the core answer to that is making sure that there's an alignment to our business objectives. So, at the enterprise level, we have these core objectives that we're looking to hit from a strategic and a revenue perspective each year, and making sure that everything that the COE is focused on is enabling those objectives, right, in some
Right.
capacity. So having that alignment to the strategy is core. Making sure that when you're evaluating performance objectives, when you're going through your performance reviews, that the goals of your team members are aligned to your goals, which are aligned to the corporate goals. So having
Mm.
that connective tissue across the board, and regular upward communication around the roadmap, the commits that happen on a quarterly basis, really solidifying that cross functional communication so that there's buy-in across the board, and then there's no at the end of the day that there's no mistakes or hiccups at the end of the day, or confusion what you were working on, and what the COE was focused on during the year. And that's what it comes down to.
Right. So then, like, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's essentially you have to make sure that those are intrinsically bound to the organizational goals established by executive leadership, and then benchmark improvements in those goals as you progress along. So, do you break that down into the identification of which processes impact which goals? And so, then what process improvements you've done or valuation increases you've done as a result of that? Is that how, like, not trying to get too detailed, but like, how do you go from kind of the more ethereal, here's a business goal, we want to make more money, and you're like, oh, great, okay. Well, uh, what business processes are intrinsically bound to curating revenue, and maybe they have like a increasing their customer base by X%, right? Okay, well then now it's going to be like, in order to be in alignment with that goal, what are the marketing and sales processes that makes that occur? Like,
Right.
am I getting that properly, or?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different, right? Like, so when I've been involved in setting the strategic plan for the next 3 to 5 years, and then evaluating budget planning for the upcoming year, there are kind of targeted goals focused around cost savings, focused around growth and revenue, um, honing in on kind of your top three or top five products and or services that you're bringing to market, thematically looking at win zones, thematically looking at kind of regional expansion. So it all kind of breaks down into those different dimensions. And how is the COE going to align themselves to initiatives or projects that are focused around making an impact to those particular corporate initiatives? So kind of breaking down the granularity as you go down the roadmap. And when I think about implementation of AI at the enterprise, right? Obviously, there's efficiency gains, there's synergies to be
Right.
developed. Whether it's in the sales operations side of things or the marketing side. I look at it from a cost, OpEx impact that we can have. What do we do around data retention? What do we maintain? How do we maintain our data governance framework to prevent any, regulatory fines coming down the pike?
Right.
There's so many different dimensions to evaluate. Often, you've got to break it down based upon those corporate objectives that are handed down to you.
Has there been like ways you framed certain questions to kind of instigate that collaboration with the executive leadership on moving forward? You kind of mentioned a handful of things that is kind of usually out of the purview of, say, your chief financial officer, your CEO, and like data governance, for example. So, how do you kind of frame that in such a way that they can properly perceive and understand, hey, here's how master data management, for example, or data governance is a key pillar stone to X strategic executive organ. You get what I'm saying? So,
Yep.
like, what are some things you've done in order to kind of frame and tee those things up?
Yeah, I typically leverage our development roadmap to do that, right? And kind of breaking down that roadmap into the individual feature sets, those projects that are going to influence said core strategic objective, and provide that prospective impact, right? Like, give them the projection of, if we do master data management and we're able to cleanse the data lineage and catalog all the data appropriately, we'll have this level of impact to the bottom line. We'll implement data retention policies to prevent having more than 7 years worth of data stored in our data warehouse, which are yielding certain amount of cloud operation, cloud retention costs or cloud storage costs. um, and this is going to have a downstream impact. We've implemented, at the product level more often than not, a product level P&L, right? So we're
Hmm.
evaluating the impact that our projects are having, and providing that ROI. So I know if definitively that I have a a product that it operates in the cloud. It's a web-based application. It leverages all of this telemetry data, maybe from a connected vehicle, and it's a costly endeavor. But I'm also translating that data into insights that I can monetize in market, and generate, top line revenue from that. So when I do that cost of goods sold analysis and I collect
Yeah.
an ROI, I can see if there's a